You found the skeleton. How would you tell people that it's you personally? How would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I'm here to talk about the late David Menton's talk about human evolution. Last time, he was failing utterly to show what an ape is, instead simply pointing out that humans have unique traits, as if other ape species don't, and as if being unique within a group makes you not part of that group. He's going to continue doing that, so let's just dive in.
Let's take a look at this. This is a chimp here. This is supposed to be the most similar to humans of living primates. You've all probably seen a chimpanzee. And it has nasal bones right here, but they're flat. So next time you're at the zoo, you might want to do an experiment. Go up to the biggest, meanest looking silverback gorilla you can find, get a hold of his schnoz. You can push it all over his face because it's all soft tissue, no bone in it. Now, they get testy, so I don't recommend doing this, actually.
Yay for jokes about harassing zoo animals! But actually, as you can see in this picture of a gorilla skull, gorillas actually do have raised nasal bones. I guess that makes gorillas a kind of human, or at least not apes. Odd choice of characteristics to show that humans aren't apes, but as we'll see, this won't be the last time that Menton gives some criterion for being human and not ape that at least some gorillas meet. I guess some gorillas are human and not ape. I wonder, if you're into the idea of universal atonement, does that mean that Jesus died for some gorillas but not others? Do some gorillas descend from Adam, but not others? Who knows? Menton is just making this up as he goes, I think.
Here's another, I'm sorry, we got these backwards. This is, this is an orangutan. This is the chimp. I normally have them set up, but we got them backwards this time. So this is the chimp here. But once again, just like the orangutan you just saw, flattened nasal bones. Okay?
Okay, flat nasal bones are the basal state for apes. Not sure how pointing out that humans are derived helps say that they're not apes. Again, this is just like saying that mammals don't have blowholes, but whales do, so whales aren't mammals. All that is really saying is that whales have unusual noses for mammals, which in fact humans also do. But that doesn't make whales or humans not mammals. And it certainly doesn't make humans not apes. Which trait unique to apes as a group do humans lack? It's none.
And there's another feature that's so tiny you're going to think I'm picky just to even mention it. But if you do a little experiment, put your finger like a mustache under your nose and go up, you will hit a little bony spur sticking out. A little piece of bone. I'll show you that piece if the cameras can get in really close here now. It's this little point. Can you see it on the screen at all? They haven't been able to put a sunscreen, have they? This little point here is what we call the nasal spine. If we look at apes, they do not have a nasal spine at all.
Okay, so let's think about the scenario evolution would indicate. Humans are supposed to have evolved within the superfamily Hominoidea, that is, the apes. Now, most apes share with most other monkeys the flat nose and prognathic face that is common to all of them. But humans started to take on a distinct morphology, which of course involves changes to the skull. One of these changes is a bulbous nose with hooded nostrils, which requires bony support, so humans evolved bony support. Now Menton comes along and says that because humans have a unique morphology that they can't have evolved. But that's just him saying that humans evolved, so they couldn't have evolved. That doesn't make any sense. It's just as valid as noting that only some groups of humans typically retain epicanthic folds into adulthood, and then declaring that because they have this atypical feature, they don't count as humans anymore. Being unique within a group doesn't take you outside of the group.
And there's a good reason for that. You might ask, what is the nasal spine doing? Is it just there so we can make mustache once in a while?
It's supporting the cartilage that makes up the septum.
No, you see, the nasal spine is a ledge on which our nasal septum, which divides our nasal cavity into two halves. In humans, because our face is flat, a bit of the nasal septum actually protrudes from the nasal cavity, and it sits on top of the spine. You can see a little groove in there where it sits in that groove. Apes have a sloped face, okay? Apes have a sloped face. Can you all notice that? Okay, this isn't too subtle, is it here?
So over in the real world, where scientists do, science, that's called prognathism and refers to how much of the maxilla and premaxilla protrude. But wouldn't you know it that prognathism decreases throughout hominin evolution? And again, since having a flat face is a distinct human quality, Menton is saying that humans couldn't be apes because that would involve evolution, which is the very thing he's trying to argue against. You don't get to assume your conclusion in order to argue for it. That's what we in the biz call begging the question.
People say, yeah, but what if you hold it like that? Then it would be a vertical face. You go by the cheekbones.
He's right there. The zygomatic bone is used to help orient the skull so prognathism can be objectively compared across ape species.
Okay. When the cheekbones here, called the zygomatic arch, when that's parallel to the table or the floor, that's about the way the skull would have set on the head of the ape. And notice the slope. If you run a line out the cheekbone that's the kind of slope we're talking about. Not very subtle, is it? Pretty obvious. You take a human skull, you do the same thing. We have a cheekbone too. It's called homology. Same basic bone, same name, serve similar function.
Yeah, almost like there's an evolutionary relationship there. Weird.
That would be parallel to the ground on a human too, and if you run it out to the plane of the face, essentially perpendicular.
Cool, but we have intermediate fossils that show the reduction in prognathism over time. In fact, Australopithecus africanus and A. afarensis are already less prognathic than a chimpanzee, or an orangutan, and Homo habilis is even less so. But it's still considerably more prognathic than modern humans. Homo rudolfensis is even less prognathic still, and by the time we get to H. ergaster or H. heidelbergensis, we are at essentially a modern level of prognathism. So how do we draw the line? What measurement can we make to delineate the amount of prognathism that's so much that the animal in question isn't human? And yet again, this is Menton just saying that if humans evolved from apes, that makes them too different from other apes to have evolved from apes. It's a nonsense argument.
So those are some differences right off the bat. The slope of the face, the presence of the protruding nasal bones for a human, the lack of a nasal spine in apes, but it's present in humans. If we look at our orangutan over here, the same thing is true. No nasal spine in there.
Thanks for telling everyone that humans have the most derived skull among extant apes. I don't think that was in dispute, though.
The reason apes don't have it is because their face is sloped and the nasal septum is recessed further inside the skull. With a vertical face, the nasal bone protrudes a little bit. So there's really a reason behind all of these things that I'm showing you. What else can we say? The shape of the forehead. Humans have a curved forehead right here. This is curved, okay? You might want to do a little experiment right on your own body. You put your hand up here on your forehead, get the shape, and then when you take it away, look at it. Now, if you take your hand away and it looks like this, we need to talk right after the lecture, okay? Come by. You ought to have a curvature like this, just like this model of a human skull is. What about apes? The upper part of their face is flat.
Give me a second to calm down a bit so I don't fly off the handle. Okay, so this is the first instance where it seems hard to conclude that Menton is being honest, and I'm forced to consider it is more likely that he was lying than that he was just incompetent. You see, when he checked for that curvature on the human skull, he put his hand across the anterodorsalmost portion of the frontal bone, well above the orbit, and not really in contact with the zygomatic bone or the maxilla. But on the chimpanzee skull, he put his hand right across the orbit, covering the supraorbital margin, the nasal bones, and portions of the maxilla that make up the ventromedial portions of the margin of the orbits and the lacrimal bone. All of that is much flatter than the actual part of the frontal bone on the chimp that houses the brain, as can be plainly seen when he holds up the skull so that it's in dorsal view relative to the camera. Humans also have relatively flat faces across the orbits, although less so than chimps. And the more ventral part of their frontal bones are also curved, like those of humans. Menton just lied on stage and didn't even bother to hide it. Rather, he just showed it off blatantly. If you're a creationist watching this, I want you to consider something. Why is it that it's trivially easy for people with barely an undergraduate level of understanding in a given field to show that creationists are not just wrong in that field, but often in ways that make being honestly mistaken hard to accept as an explanation, and rather seem to indicate intentional dishonesty. In short, why do your fellow creationists lie so much? We're approaching flat Earth levels of dishonesty. I half expect Menton, after being shown the exquisitely complete fossil record of hominins, to say, interesting, like Jeranism after he demonstrated quite conclusively that the Earth was round in his own experiment.
You have a backup experiment. If you're seeing through this hole, through the next hole, and seeing the light at the backboard, or at 17 feet off the water, the Earth is flat. If he's holding it up at 23 feet high and we're seeing the light, well, that's because the Earth's curved. So I should only be able to see it when it's at 17 feet. Enrique, how high is your light?
17 feet.
We don't see you, Enrique. Lift up your light way above your head. Interesting.
You can see it here, and you can see it in the orangutan here.
Once again, putting his hand over the orbit and not the forehead. Look, Menton was a human anatomist. There's no way you can tell me he doesn't know the difference between orbits and foreheads. That's why I can't really attribute this nonsense to anything but dishonesty. There's no way he got a postgraduate degree involving human anatomy and then just honestly makes this mistake.
Okay, that leads to yet another trait that is distinctive between humans and apes. Think of two ice cream cones with the big end facing you. Okay, no ice cream in this talk, just the cones. They would be two circles, just like this. Imagine now if you cut to make a curved forehead. Remember the curved forehead we talked about? If you made a cut across those cones, they would become oval, and they would be cut back on the side. That's exactly what we see in a human. Instead of looking goggle-eyed with a nice big tall round goggle-shaped orbit, it's more oval.
Okay, but gorillas also have non-round orbits, and they have lateral margins of the orbits that are swept back in some individuals. See, I told you that we get more reason that at least some gorillas are human, according to Menton. Maybe gorillas get their own incarnation. Was there a gorilla Jesus who was crucified by a mob of chimps for the sins of the human gorillas? Plus, just like with prognathism, we have increasingly modern orbit shapes as we go through Australopithecus into early genus Homo and then later genus Homo. The whole transitional series is there, including that yes, humans are distinct among apes, but they still remain derived apes.
And that's because it's been cut. Basically, think of it as being cut in a curved forehead here. What that does is it exposes the side. If you look at the side of the skull, you can look right into the orbit, at the medial bones of the orbit here from the side. If you try this with our friend the orangutan here, you don't get much view of the orbits from the side.
Cool, do it with Australopithecus africanus. Oh, whoops. Looks like there's some curvature there. Oh, and just to pick a few transitional forms, there it is in Homo habilis, but even more so, and then there it is even more prominent in H. heidelbergensis.
So that's a collection of things. I think we've hit everything. I added one just recently. We've been talking about this cheekbone, right? The zygomatic arch. And I mentioned that humans have it. We do indeed, it's right here. And apes have it, like this chimp here.
Yep, we know. Get to the point.
What do we have that for? That is a kind of protection of a muscle that comes down here. The muscle's attached to the skull, and we call this the temporal part of the skull. It attaches there. You can even see a line on this chimp where the muscle attached. And then that muscle goes down through that hole to the mandible here, to a process on the mandible. And that's a muscle of chewing. When that muscle contracts, it bites, okay? In fact, I've just been bitten, I think. There we go. So look at how big the muscle is on this chimp. It's this whole area. I can get 3 fingers comfortably in there, and almost a fourth, okay? This human would have been much bigger than that chimp in body size. But look at the size of the space where this temporalis muscle passes through. It's very tiny here.
Some ape had to have the proportionally smallest temporalis muscle. that it's humans doesn't make them not apes. We could just as well say the gorilla with the strongest bite force of any primate, and hence the biggest temporalis muscles of all the apes, proportionally, isn't an ape, because the temporalis muscles are so big. Or let's go with that because gibbons have the longest arms proportionally among all the apes, that they're not actually apes. Or hey, among hominids, bonobos have the smallest brains. Maybe that makes them not apes. Of course, the real answer is that all taxa are internally diverse, and in any given one, some group must be the most extreme in some measurement. I don't know what it is, and I don't really care to find out, but I guarantee you that among the animals traditionally in the subfamily Caninae, that is the canines, that one species on average has the smallest temporalis muscles proportional to the rest of the skull. I don't think Menton would argue that that is an indication that that particular species is a different creation from the others.
And we still have a temporalis muscle, just like other creatures do. Attaches to the temple, goes down through there, but it's much smaller.
Hey guys, just because some part of your anatomy is much smaller than normal, it doesn't make you a different species or anything. We're not going to measure whether or not you belong just by measuring one part of your body. That's not how taxonomy works. We'll measure lots of parts.
You've heard of Lucy, we already mentioned her. And people may have told you, well, she's almost human, or she's on her way to becoming human. Let's just look at the zygomatic arch, something you never worried about before, but now when you look at an ape man, you're going to be looking for the zygomatic arch. Right? If you look at that, I'll tell you, you get bit by a creature like Lucy, you're going to stay bit. That's just massive. I can get 4 fingers through this. And how tall was Lucy?
Like about 1 meter tall, if I remember correctly. A little more, I think, but not much.
3 feet 7 inches tall.
Hey, look at that. I'd say 1 meter and 9 centimeters, which is what that turns into, is pretty much spot on for 1 meter plus a little more. I'm going to call that me correctly remembering how tall Lucy is. That's pretty good, since I routinely forget how tall Tyrannosaurus Rex is, and people seem to think I should have that number tucked away to my brain, ready to go.
With chewing muscles this size, that I don't think any human being has ever existed with the temporalis muscles being that thick.
Yep, that's probably outside the range for Homo sapiens, but, Australopithecus afarensis isn't Homo sapiens. Hence, the different names. So I'm not sure what the point is. No one is disputing that Lucy was an ape. Also, what's the cutoff? How big do the temporalis muscles have to be before we can confidently conclude that the skull in question belonged to an ape and not a human? I'm going to go ahead and guess that we'll never get to hear what the cutoff is, much less any actual defense of that cutoff.
So that's kind of here's another little trick you can look for in an ape. We call this a dental arcade. Humans have an arch like the St. Louis arch.
New heel for my shoe. So I decided to go to Morganville, which is what they call Shelbyville in those days. So I
You
tied an
look at
onion
this
to
human
my
from the
belt,
bottom. Doesn't that remind
which
you
was
of
the
St.
style
Louis
at the
Arch? Have you
time.
been to St.
No.
Louis? And apes have a U-shaped arch.
Well, kinda. Among non-human extant apes, the dental arcade is boxy with a distinct angle from the canines, whereas in humans, the whole dental arcade is roughly parabolic. But interestingly, in animals like Australopithecus, we see an intermediate condition. The exact thing you'd expect if humans had evolved and Australopithecus was closer to humans than to other apes, but still retain many of the basal traits of other apes. This is just once again Menton saying that because humans are derived, they didn't evolve. But being derived is kind of what evolution does. So it's basically him saying humans are too evolved to have evolved. It really doesn't make any sense. Also, again, how parabolic does the dental arcade have to be before we say that the animal isn't an ape? Just like prognathism and orbit shape, this is something that comes closer and closer to the modern human condition as you look at various hominins through geologic time.
Now, there are humans that are more U-shaped than others, and there are apes that might have a slight width. But when you put all these things together that we've been talking about, believe me, you can pick out the apes from the humans.
No, all we've shown is that among extant apes plus one extinct hominin, the modern humans are easy to distinguish among those other apes. But that was never in question. It's not like scientists are going around mixing up humans and orangutans all the time. But similarly, among the animals that Menton does think are evolutionarily related, like lions and jaguars, people aren't really mixing them up either. Jaguars are unique among cats, so by Menton's logic, they must not be cats. But the problem is that all cat species are unique, as are all ape species. So unless he wants to go with species fixity and separate creation for each species, pointing out what makes a species unique doesn't do anything to remove it from the family it's evidently in.
In fact, let's just do that. Let's look at a group of genuine ape men. I mentioned Australopithecus sediba. Remember, that was the recent one that was found that is supposed to be very close to Homo? And on the left is Australopithecus sediba, and on the right is a human. Let's just apply the things we just learned. What about protruding nasal bones?
Well, Australopithecus sediba has a protruding nasal bone, so I guess it's a human.
Does Australopithecus sediba come through for us there?
Yep, just like the gorilla did.
I don't think so.
I mean, okay, that's great and all, but it has a noticeably raised nasal bone. Sure, it's not as extreme as in Homo sapiens, but it's still protruding. So are we going to introduce some actual metric for how much nasal bone sticky outiness counts?
Compared to the human. By the way, people say that Australopithecines have protruding nasal bones. Here's Lucy. What they're talking about is a little burr here, where the two nasal bones come together, just a little ridge. It is no protruding bone at all, but if your mind is biased towards making an ape into a monkey, then you make a big deal out of that ridge.
Okay, so the nasal bones protrude where the joint between the left and right nasal bones form. This results in a protrusion of the nasal bone. I don't know how to take this other than to say, yes, Australopithecus afarensis has a protruding nasal bone. Good to see that Menton is just lying to our faces and showing us that he's doing so.
Well, let's look at another feature of the skull.
Oh good, we're moving on without any quantifiable criteria for why nasal protrusion in Australopithecus doesn't count. Just some nuh-uh.
What about the slope of the face? You're looking at sediba on the left, human on the right. I think you can see the obvious slope on the face of sediba. So,
oh yes, I can. But funny how when you compare it to, say, a chimpanzee, it's intermediate between the human and the chimp. Almost as if we have a transitional species here. And you know what? Just because it's been a while, here's a slideshow that includes some hominids. That was fun. And heck, just because I can, here's Dr. Banjo acting just like David Menton.
I cannot speak for you, sir, but my ancestors were not monkeys. They were orangutans, hard-working, patriotic orangutans.
Dr. Banjo?
In the fur. And I remind you that evolution is merely a theory, like gravity or the shape of the Earth. If your elitist East Coast evolution is real, why has no one found the missing link between modern humans and ancient apes?
We did find it. It's called Homo erectus.
Then you have proven my case, sir. For no one has found the link between apes and this Homo erectus.
Yes, they have. It's called Homo habilis.
Aha! But no one has found the missing link between ape and the so-called Homo habilis.
Yes, they have. It's called Australopithecus africanus.
Oh, I've got you now. Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius Massili? Answer me that, Professor.
Oh, okay, granted that one missing link is still missing. But just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Pshaw! Things don't exist simply because you believe in them. Thus saith the almighty creature in the sky!
that would be a trait that would certainly be considered very ape-like.
Interesting. So prognathism means that an animal is more ape-like. So I guess chimpanzees are more ape-like than Australopithecus sediba, and so A. sediba is more human-like than most of the other apes. Sounds like precisely what we would expect to find if humans indeed did evolve from apes.
What about the visibility of the orbits as viewed from the side? Can you look right in? Here again, it's much easier to see into the orbit of the curved forehead of the human.
Yeah, but once again, compared to a chimp skull, and you find that Australopithecus is intermediate between the basal ape condition and the derived human condition. Weird how this species, generally seen as transitional, keeps showing that its morphology is more human than that of other apes. It's almost like this is excellent evidence for human evolution and common ancestry with other apes.
Whereas Lucy's forehead, and this is not really so much a replica as a kind of a reconstruction of fossils that have been found called Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy for short. Flat forehead like any proper ape.
Yet again putting his hands over the orbits of the Australopithecus skull and not the forehead, while showing the forehead to the camera so we can all see that it is in fact curved. Good to see we're sticking with the blatant and obvious lies theme of the show. At least the lies weren't quite so obvious in the bird and dinosaur talk.
Round orbits like any proper ape.
So here's the skull of Lemur cata, the ring-tailed lemur. It has really round orbits. I guess maybe it's an ape. Except remember how last episode we went through the basic exercise to see if something is an ape? Yeah, it stops being in the same group after primate, so it's not even a monkey. Well, here's the skull of a Nycticebus, not sure which species, but it's a slow loris. Notice those extremely round orbits. But again, this isn't even a monkey, despite being a primate. Well, okay, let's look at something that is a monkey. Here's the skull of Leontopithecus rosalia, the golden lion tamarin, which is personally one of my favorite monkeys. Sadly, they are absent from almost all of their original range, but are making a numerical recovery thanks to reintroduction and captive breeding programs. Anyway, look how round those orbits are. But still, these aren't old-world monkeys like apes. So let's head to the next. Here's a Semnopithecus skull. That is the skull of a langur. Notice how it too has round eye sockets, but it's still not an ape. So we now know that round eye sockets don't make one an ape. Many primates that aren't apes have round eye sockets. But perhaps all apes have round eye sockets, so it's still a useful metric for excluding humans from the apes. Well, here's a gorilla skull. Its orbits are actually the least round we've seen so far. If anything, they're less round than human orbits are. Are gorillas the real children of God made in his image? I'm not a theologian, but I'm betting that the surviving staff at AIG would probably say no. So perhaps since round orbits are found all over the primate order and are not universal to apes, with both genera gorilla and Homo having less than round orbits, this is a bad way to judge whether humans are apes.
No protruding nasal bone, no nasal spine.
Except that Menton already showed us the protruding nasal bone and just said it didn't count for reasons that don't make any sense, because they're also true of Homo sapiens nasal bones, at least as he described them. But also, let's remember that gorillas also often have protruding nasal bones. It's almost like Menton doesn't actually have any good reasons to show why humans aren't apes. Instead, he's just deciding that things that make humans unique among apes makes them not apes, but that isn't the case for the other apes. The huge size of gorillas and their extreme bite force and sagittal crests are hugely derived and very unusual among apes, but that's okay because he doesn't care about gorillas. They can stay apes. And on the other hand, the human weak bite force and funny dental arcade makes them not apes for some reason.
U-shaped.
So interesting. Let's look at the maxillary and premaxillary teeth of the three taxa: Pantroglodytes, Australopithecus afarensis, and Homo sapiens. First, note that the canines are reduced in Australopithecus compared to Pantroglodytes, making them intermediate in canine size, but also notice that Pantroglodytes has a gap or diastema between the incisors and the canines, whereas Australopithecus and Homo do not. Also notice that the row of incisors in the chimpanzee is straighter than in either the human or the Australopithecus. Now, in the shape of the row of the molars and premolars, the Australopithecus is nearly identical to the chimpanzee. It's almost like Australopithecus is a perfect transitional form intermediate between basal Miocene apes and modern humans.
Big zygomatic arch here.
I still have no idea why the zygomatic arch or temporalis muscle size is a big deal. Once again, going back to gorillas, theirs is enormously bigger than all the other apes, and yet that doesn't exclude them from being apes, according to Benton. So why does the relatively small arch of humans exclude them? Oh, right, it's special pleading.
But notice the orbits of the eye are round, goggle-eyed. And from the side, you can hardly see into them because the forehead's flat.
I've already covered why all of that is stupid in some depth. I don't see a need to do so again. Just rewatch this video if you're not clear on why all of this is dishonest and dumb.
Are you sort of getting the hang of this? You think you're a little better prepared to go into a museum that purports to show human evolution and find your way through?
No.
What about the cranial capacity? Maybe Australopithecus sediba comes through there.
What does that even mean? Australopithecus sediba isn't a human, so there's no reason to expect it to have a cranial capacity within the human range.
And the cranial capacity for sediba is 400 cc's. That is, if you were to take the skull and you got this hole called the foramen magnum, and you were to pour, say, millet seed in there, and then dump it out into a graduated cylinder, you could see how many cc's fit to give you the capacity.
To the surprise of no one, two species of ape don't have the same cranial capacity, because no two species of ape do. Let's look at a chart of hominin cranial capacity. Hey look, you can find any capacity from 300 cubic centimeters all the way to about 1750, considerably higher than modern Homo sapiens in hominins. And there's a very noticeable tendency towards higher cranial capacity as you go forward in time. Almost like hominins were under directional selection for larger brains for a very long time. Interestingly, the low end of capacity for Homo habilis is within the high end of the range for Australopithecus africanus and A. afarensis, and the low end for Homo erectus. And the low end for Homo erectus is within the high end for Homo habilis, and the low end for Homo heidelbergensis is within the high end for Homo erectus, and the lower end for Homo sapiens is within the high end of H. heidelbergensis. It's like we have a transitional series for brain size with literally no gaps. Pick a cranial capacity between 400 and modern humans at 1400 or 1500, and you can find a hominin with that capacity, and at about the predicted point in time where it would make sense for the evolution of humans from more basal apes. Human evolution doesn't go from A. sediba directly to H. sapiens, and pointing out that they're not the same species does nothing to counter the mountains of evidence in favor of human evolution.
The old idea was big brains are smart, and little brains aren't so smart, so they made a big deal out of brain size among human beings. Turns out the cranial capacity of a human being ranges, the normal range is from about 700 cc's at the small end up to about 2 liter at the large end, and for a human male, about 1.4 or 1.5 liters. And there's no correlation between intelligence and body size.
Yep, human intelligence within the species is not correlated to cranial capacity, whether in absolute terms or scaled to be proportional with body size. But still, one of the major ways in which humans are derived compared to other primates is their enormous brain size. So it's important, if you want to argue for the evolution of humans from other primates, that you have some account of how their brains got to be the big monstrous globes of anxiety meat that they are today. Fortunately for all involved, the fossil record of hominins is full of apes of increasing cranial capacity.
Because women, on average, have a little bit smaller cranial capacity than men. And they're not less intelligent by any means, but their bodies, on average, are a little smaller. And so their cranial capacity. Cranial capacity normally will run with weight or size. The bigger the brain.
Also true, but there's another metric called encephalization quotient that scales brain size against body size to reveal how big the brain is proportionally. And in this too, hominins increase over time until we finally arrive at the modern encephalization quotient of Homo sapiens.
What about apes? They have about the same range of variability in size, from about 300 up to 500 cc's for an ape.
Well then, I guess Australopithecus africanus and afarensis weren't apes, given that they both have maximum cranial capacities closer to 600 cc's. So was Lucy not an ape and instead a human, just like those gorillas we saw earlier that according to Menton's criteria fit in with the humans rather than what he would call apes?
And again, it correlates with the size of the ape, with a gorilla having a really big brain compared to a chimp.
Yep. Not sure what the point is, though. Also, have you noticed that he still hasn't actually bothered to tell us what an ape is? At no point so far has he given us a way to look at any given animal and tell us with any confidence if it's an ape or not. It's like he was allergic to having a talk about classification in any way that's useful. Now, dear audience, tell me in the comments if you think that this is because David Menton was an idiot, a liar, or both.
But overall, we can say that the cranial capacity of a human is about 3 times the size of the average ape.
Well, only if you take humans out of the mix before you do the average, but let's try with mass and see if we can do the same thing to exclude gorillas from the apes. The average mass of an ape, including humans, but excluding gorillas, is about 67 1/3 kilograms. The average mass of a gorilla is about 220 kilograms. Wow, the gorilla is more than 3 1/4 times as massive as an ape. I guess they sure aren't apes. Or maybe we recognize that Menton is special pleading and that pointing out that one species of ape is the most extreme in some category, whether it be cranial capacity, bite force, or mass, doesn't actually do anything to remove that superlative species from the wider group. Some ape had to be the tallest, the shortest, the biggest brained, the smallest brained, the least massive, the most massive. Pointing out that some species happens to be the one at the extreme of the range of the family doesn't remove it from the family. And by and large, creationists know this. They don't go around saying that Paleoloxodon falconeri wasn't an elephant, despite only being a meter tall, when today elephants are 3 times as tall. They don't say that gorillas are just too heavy to be apes. But when it comes to humans, for some reason, having some extreme morphologies suddenly is of taxonomic significance in ways that it never is for the other animals. Of course, we know the reason, really. It's because the Bible, according to their interpretation, says that humans are the special boys of creation, and therefore must be a separate creation from anything else. So they come at the science with this conclusion already in mind, and they are not allowed to deviate from it, no matter what the evidence actually shows. This is the opposite of how science is supposed to work, and it's why I maintain that creationism is not just pseudoscience, it's anti-science.
But it's the way the brain's put together that makes the big difference between humans and apes.
Now we're being introduced to yet another supposed characteristic of apes, brain architecture. No citation, no actual description yet of how that architecture is characteristic of apes, but absent in humans. But who knows, maybe we're about to launch into a long discussion of neurology, which is what we should do if he wants to make this argument.
Our ability for abstract thought and anticipating the future and what have you, and discussing the beauty of something. Obviously, no animal has done anything remotely like that.
So I would never dispute that humans have the highest capacity for abstract thought among the apes. But do other apes lack this capacity, or do they simply have a lesser capacity for it, the same way all apes have a lesser capacity for bite force than gorillas? Great apes of all kinds routinely pass one of the classic tests of self-awareness, the mirror test. If a spot of paint is put on the forehead of an ape, any ape, it is capable of recognizing this fact upon seeing itself in a reflective surface. We can tell because they see the spot of paint on the ape in the mirror, and then they reach for their own forehead to investigate the spot of paint. Compare this to the behavior of a dog or cat seeing itself in the mirror. As I think most people know, dogs and cats treat their reflections as other animals. They don't have the capacity to realize that the animal in the mirror is doing exactly what they do, and then using their imagination to realize that that animal is actually themselves, and they can examine their own body by looking in the mirror. Instead, they're stuck reacting to their own reflection like it's another dog or cat. This requires a significant amount of abstraction and imagination. But beyond this, apes have a theory of mind. They recognize not only that other members of their own species, but even members of other species, have their own perspective and may not have information that they themselves have. They can put themselves mentally in the shoes of another animal and imagine what its perspective would be like, and how that will likely influence that animal's behavior. I don't think we're anywhere close to chimpanzees writing the next great work of literature, but they certainly can think abstractly. They act in ways that in humans would be associated with curiosity, fear, anger, empathy, love, sadness, and shame. They can put themselves in the shoes of others in their imagination. They can recognize that they are a discrete entity in the environment and are curious even about their own bodies. Indeed, even other old world monkeys that are not apes have these capacities to some degree. Humans are different in degree, not kind.
So there again, I would say it's an ape, and overall, what would the conclusion be? Well, based on the skull, I'd say an ape.
I mean, yeah, literally no paleoanthropologist is suggesting that Australopithecus sediba is not an ape. It's very obviously an ape.
One of the most important pieces of evidence we could look for would be cultural artifacts. Apes just don't make tools.
Chimpanzees not only make tools, but they have their own archaeological record, because they make tools out of stone. The Ivory Coast has chimp stone tools going back to about where Menton thinks the flood was. And not just stones that have been touched by chimps, but ones that were modified to make them better tools. Granted, pen and tool use is very basic compared to hominin tool use, but it certainly exists. Further, with human guidance, bonobos, that is, Pan-Paniscus, can be trained to do things like start fires and roast marshmallows and help cook pasta, as is evidenced in the bonobo Nodus kanzi.
And use them then to make other tools.
Wait, you need to make tools to count as human? Flint knapping, one of the most basic technologies ever used by humans, doesn't involve first creating a tool to make tools. You just use natural stones to start off with. So I guess if chimps were making stone axe heads, but they were doing it by knapping, with naturally occurring stones, that wouldn't count. That's arbitrary and obviously would exclude some members of Homo sapiens from being humans.
This is a feature of humans, and wherever you find proper human skeletons or fossils, usually sooner or later you'll find evidence of human habitation or hunting or cooking or artwork, what have you. We'll talk about that when we have a few specific examples.
I mean, yeah, human remains tend to be associated with human tools. But hey, we have chimp tools from the ancient past too. So this isn't really a distinction. Humans, once again, are just doing something more than the other apes, but other apes are still doing it.
So I would say overall, Australopithecus sediba strikes me as being an ape.
Well, yeah, no one disputes that. When the claim is that humans are apes, all their ape ancestors will be apes too.
And not related in any necessary way to humans.
Ah, I see. So their morphological intermediacy is just a happy coincidence. Weird how evolution predicted the existence of such transitional forms, not just for humans, but for all life. And hey, we found them! And far more than in just the human lineage. In fact, it's that time again.
Remember when I showed you the chart at the very beginning was Ardipithecus remitis? That was one of the first ones that separated, presumably, from those creatures that became apes?
No, it was already an ape. It separated from those apes that became chimpanzees and bonobos. It had already separated from the apes that would become gibbons, orangutans, and gorillas.
Take one look at the orbits of the eye there. What would you say we're looking at? Those shapes of those orbits are just screaming ape.
Unlike gorilla orbits, according to Menton.
The nose bones are flat. It's hard to see that when you're looking from the front. There is no nasal spine. But look at the width of the skull here. Right here, see here? And look at the width of the cheekbones. If we were put together in that proportion, I would have cheekbones out here someplace. And I'd have a massive zygomatic arch through which a huge temporalis muscle ran. So you see how powerful these little things are when you're looking for details? At least you can critically evaluate.
Yeah, you can critically evaluate and find that the earliest hominids are morphologically distinct from the later ones, H. sapiens included, which is, what's predicted by evolution. And in fact, you find that they are less derived, that is more morphologically similar to the ancestral Miocene apes than humans are. Which again is sort of the point. Basically, Menton is just saying that the transitional hominids are so transitional that they don't count. Evolution predicted them so perfectly that we should probably just ignore evolution. To turn the tables, it would be like if you could watch the resurrection of Jesus and then turned around and said, "See, I knew it. Christianity is completely wrong."
And the cranial capacity of Ardipithecus remitis was 300 cc's, which puts it at the small end of apes.
Yep, hominids were generally smaller in the past and most lineages have become bigger over time. Even the bonobos would be fairly large compared to the apes of, say, 7 million years ago. But who is arguing that Ardipithecus wasn't an ape? Certainly not paleoanthropologists. Plus, we're not even actually being given a reason it is an ape. Because remember, Menton never mentioned any of those. He apparently didn't really care.
So I would conclude that Ardipithecus is an ape.
Hooray! He finally got to the same conclusion as literally everyone else.
What about Australopithecus africanus? We mentioned that. That was in the side chute. Some people believe it became extinct and went no further. Others believe no, it went on up to Australopithecus sediba. This is a juvenile. It happened that the first Australopithecine found was a juvenile. And I have a replica of a chimp skull in my office, and I have a replica of this fossil of Australopithecus africanus, and it's very difficult to tell the two apart.
I'm not a human anatomist or a primatologist, but even I'm calling bullshit on this. Chimpanzees have much bigger brow ridges, they're much more prognathic, they have much larger canines, they have a gap between the top incisors and the top canines that allows the bottom canines to fit into place. A. africanus has a more parabolic shape to the anterior tooth row and a more ventral foramen magnum than chimpanzees. It also has a proportionally larger brain case, if not an absolutely larger one. If Menton can't tell these species apart, then I can't help but wonder how bad he was at his job of teaching anatomy.
They love to show this because the cranial size, look at the size of the brain relative to the face, that's quite large, but that's typical of the juveniles in primates in general.
That's why when I showed the skulls, I compared adults. Why didn't Menton? Is it so he could accuse his intellectual opponents of being misleading when in fact he's been demonstrably wrong about virtually everything this whole time? And if anyone is being misleading, it's him? Well, now that he's an ex-ape, I guess we can't ask him. But I can say, hey, don't be an idiot like an AIG PhD. Go get your shots.
The brain is larger at first because it develops early. Even in the embryo as we're growing and into the fetus, the brain's very precocious and grows very quickly. And the spinal cord, part of the central nervous system, grows very quickly. The rest of the body kind of catches up later.
Yep, that's why babies have such big ol' noggins. And also why baby humans look a lot more like baby chimps and gorillas than adult humans look like adult chimps or gorillas. But then again, that's in line with the ontological evidence for their shared common ancestry.
I guess it's because those particular features are needed earlier in development.
Maybe it's because the nervous system can't really afford to expend lots of energies on growth. I don't really know. I don't think it matters much to this discussion, though. And to be fair, I don't think Menton would have disagreed with me there, so I won't make it a big deal.
In any event, if you apply all the criteria we've talked about, I think we've got another ape on our hands here.
Yeah, but these are all going to be apes. And his criteria don't make them apes, because as we've seen, his criteria would also make many non-apes apes, and some clearly non-human apes like gorillas into humans. So his criteria are useless. But yes, I will keep saying it.
Now let's get to a creature they actually call a man, or a human. Nutcracker Man. Have you heard of Nutcracker Man?
I have. It's a common name. But notice that the actual name given is Paranthropus, which doesn't mean human. It means near human or next to human. So this isn't considered to be a human by anyone, by any definition of human I'm familiar with.
He goes by a lot of different names. Most popular one today is probably the one given, Paranthropus boisei.
The only other one that's a formal name that I'm aware of in the literature is Australopithecus boisei, which sure doesn't make it human. The genus Paranthropus is also not thought to be ancestral to genus Homo by anyone that I'm aware of, and as far as I can tell, never has been. Also, before he says it, yes, it was an ape.
Others called it Australopithecus boisei, and some call it Australopithecus, implying that it's very large, or gargantuan Australopithecus.
So the only other name is Australopithecus then. Not exactly many other names, but whatever.
Now, first of all, look at the top of the skull. You see this ridge here? You look at a male gorilla, you see the same thing. It's called a sagittal crest. It's right on top of the head here. And what's that for?
It's for anchoring large temporalis muscles.
A weather vane or something when the creature's walking? No, the temporalis muscle is so huge on this creature, while the skull is so small, there's not enough room on the skull to attach the temporalis muscle. So you have to have a big ridge. On the top here, you can see a hint of it here, 2 little lines. That's where the temporalis muscle come together.
Gee, I wonder if that's what gave Paranthropus the nickname of Nutcracker Man, because of its giant jaw muscles that would have resulted in high bite force. It's almost like Paranthropus was adapted for a durophagous lifestyle, that is, eating tough things. You know, like nuts. Also, you see similar adaptations in gorillas, who, while they prefer softer foods, are perfectly willing and able to eat extremely tough foods when their preferred diet is not available.
But at some point, you have to have a plate up here. So if you were to tap a gorilla on the skull, any place off the center line, you'd be tapping an inch or 2 of muscle between your finger and the skull, all related to chewing. So talk about bite, they have that ability. And I guess that's why they called this creature Nutcracker Man, because they figured, boy, he'd really be good at cracking nuts.
But wait, if having an extremely huge brain takes humans outside of apes, why doesn't having extremely large temporalis muscles, even compared to other apes, not take both Paranthropus and gorilla outside of the apes? Could we be continuing to special plead? Perhaps.
Today, they're not even sure he ate nuts or anything else.
I could say with 100% confidence that Paranthropus ate nuts or anything else. That's what all animals eat.
Notice the zygomatic arch is huge, which you'd expect here.
Yep, so huge that it's way huger than normal for most apes. Probably not an ape by the type of logic Menton uses, so if he concludes that this is an ape, we'll know he's special pleading with humans all along, since Paranthropus is way outside the typical on this aspect of its anatomy compared to other apes.
The face is very sloped, no protruding nasal bones, and no nasal spine. Goggle-eyed, see the round goggle eyes. Again, an ape.
Actually, while it's true that Paranthropus doesn't really have a protruding nasal bone, it actually is only weakly prognathic, and is definitely intermediate between the prognathism found in other apes and that found in humans. This, along with its bipedality, is why it's considered a hominin. But notice that we're only given an anterior view, meaning that we can't easily determine how prognathic the face is. That's convenient. At least this time the lie is hidden better than it was in other parts of the talk. Menton did get a bit smarter here, if also more devious.
What about this one? Have you heard of him? Cro-Magnon man. Now, you can't just trust the word man when they throw it in, like they did with Nutcracker Man. I think it was an ape.
Hooray for special pleading! And with that fine display of intellectual dishonesty, it's time for me to bow out for now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, hit the like button. If you didn't, tell me what you didn't like in the comments and hit the dislike button. Either way, I hope you hit the subscribe button and use the bell icon to turn on all notifications so you're always alerted when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Ben Tovand, Tapioca Weasel, Cynically Skeptic, Denny5252, Elron Teller, Farava, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babbity, San, Sphincter of Doom, and the Venerable Bede. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.
How